the good news is that I'm not a scientist, I'm not an ologist. I just drag heavy things around cold places. So there are no graphs, no charts, no correlations, no extrapolations. I'm just going to show you my holiday snaps from this spring and tell you a few stories. Holiday snaps from a journey of some 800 miles on foot, or on ski most of the time, for 72 days alone, on the frozen and sometimes not so frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean. On May 11th this year, I stood alone at the North Geographic Pole. That's where all the time zones converge, all the lines of longitude converge, the axis of the Earth's rotation. I haven't finished yet. I was the only human being in an area 1.5 times the size of the United States of America. I was the 4th person in history to have skied alone to this point. Over 2,000 have climbed Everest. 12 people have stood on the moon. Including me, only 4 people have skied alone to the North Pole. The reason for that is that it's a journey that is pretty close to the limits of human capability. My journey this spring was 31 marathons back-to-back, dragging food and supplies for 10 weeks through one of the toughest climates on the planet. And of course, conditions are getting harder year on year as the direct result of climate change in the high Arctic. I'd like to talk today for a little while about human endeavor, about life at the edge of the envelope, if you will. I'm also going to talk about the huge part that technology played in my journey this spring, about how, I suppose, I got into this in the first place, what's happening next, and ultimately, the hardest question, which is why I do what I do. I'm going to start with how I got into it. For as long as I can remember, I think I read a thing I don't know if you guys have in the States. It's called a Ladybird book, a little children's book. I read a Ladybird book about a guy called Captain Scott, the first British person to reach the South Pole in 1912. And from then on, I dreamt of being a polar explorer in the kind of Edwardian heroic sense. And I started to grow up, and I realized that there probably wasn't really much call for explorers nowadays. Everyone knows where the North Pole is. There was a webcam at the North Pole last year. The South Pole, there is a big scientific base. There's an airstrip. There's a cafe. There's a tourist shop. Secondly, I began to realize how difficult it would be to organize my own expedition. The commitment, the fundraising, the logistics, the training, the risk. My parents, of course, told me to get real. And I started to doubt whether I would actually get a chance to see either one of the poles with my own eyes. But the funny thing about these dreams is that they never quite leave you alone, and my first expedition came together in the spring of 2001. It was with a guy called Penn Haddow, enormously experienced Arctic expert, I suppose. One radio station called us Penn and Ben, the Polar Men. We were trying to ski from this group of islands off the north coast of Siberia to the North Geographic Pole. The North Magnetic Pole is around here somewhere, just off the coast of Canada. So we were skiing to the geographic North Pole. We were on an absolute shoestring budget. We were trying to do it unsupported. Unsupported means that we were going to be pulling, literally wearing harnesses, dragging sledges with everything that we'd need for this 2-month journey. Food, mostly food in the sledge. Fuel for the cooker so we can melt snow to rehydrate the food. 1 change of underwear, tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, repair kit, that kind of thing. In total, we were each dragging 110 kilos, which I think is about 240 pounds behind us. One of the interesting things, one of the things that fascinated me about the North Pole is that this is about as good as maps get. It's slap bang in the middle of the sea, in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. It's a pretty big area, 5,500 square miles, 1.5 times the size of America. And to get to the pole, you've got to ski literally over the frozen crust of the Arctic Ocean. And I'd read all the books. I'd studied maps and charts and logbooks. I'd spoken to all the experts, but to tell you the truth, looking back to day 1 of that expedition, as the helicopter dropped us off right on the north coast of Siberia, I realized very quickly indeed that I had no idea quite what I had landed myself in. I was 23 at the time. This was March 2001. We had a pretty tough time. Pretty much everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. We were attacked by a polar bear on day 2. I don't think I'm going to have time for the bear story, maybe at the end. I had frostbite in my left big toe. We had communication problems. This was a homemade tent, single skin tent. You can see 2 ski poles coming out of the roof. That was our radio antenna. We had no satellite phone. We had HF radio. Very limited battery life, and because of the battery life and the electromagnetic conditions in the atmosphere, very poor radio reception. In 2 months, we had less than 2 hours two-way communication with the outside world. We had bad ice, bad weather, ultimately very bad luck. We ran out of time. There's a very limited time window to accomplish this kind of expedition before the ice melts too much in the summer. Helicopters, planes can't come in to pick you up. And we ran out of time. Helicopters picked us up 200 miles short of the pole. We'd skied 400 miles. We were 2/3 of the way there. And we were picked up. I felt that I had failed. I'd been beaten by the Arctic. The only goal that had mattered to me for so many years, we'd fallen short of. And skiing along back in 2001, I had 2 imaginary video clips, I suppose, that I would play over and over again in my mind, and I'd kind of embellish as I replayed them, that would keep me going when the chips were really down, the going got tough. The first one was reaching the pole itself. I could see this, I think with kind of rock music playing in the background, being filmed out of a helicopter coming to pick us up. I had a ski pole, a big Union Jack flying, and I'd sort of stick the flag in the pole, and the rock music, reach a crescendo, and the helicopter comes in. The second video clip was getting back to Heathrow Airport, getting back home, and I could see vividly, I could see the camera flashes going off, the paparazzi, the autograph hunters, the book agents coming to sign me up for a deal. And of course, neither of these happened. We didn't get to the pole, we were picked up short, and of course, we were on such a tight budget, we didn't pay anyone to do the PR, so no one had heard about this expedition. We got back to Heathrow. There was my mum, my brother, my granddad had a little Union Jack, little flag, who was waving. I went back to live with my mum for a while after the first expedition. I was a wreck, absolutely exhausted. We'd misjudged the nutrition. I'd lost a lot of weight. Mentally completely spaced out, convinced I was a failure. I was pretty quickly fired from my job, in a huge amount of debt from this trip, and lying there on my mum's sofa watching daytime TV. I thought, it doesn't get much worse than this. My brother sent me a text message. It was a quote from The Simpsons, from Homer Simpson, and it read, "You tried your hardest and failed miserably." The lesson is, don't even try. But I think deep down, of course, I knew I had to get back to the Arctic and prove to myself that I could do this, to challenge my demons, I suppose, in one of the most incredible stadiums you can imagine. I've since learned the Norwegians have an expression. Norwegians do a lot of this kind of thing. It's called polar hulla, and it loosely translates as an irrational yearning for very cold places. So I think I'd contracted polar hulla on this first trip as well. The plan I started hatching as soon as I turned off the daytime TV was to ski right across from Russia, same start point, to the pole in the middle somewhere, and then across to the coast of Canada, to make the first unsupported, solo and unsupported ski crossing of the Arctic Ocean. Never been done. Probably the last big expedition challenge in the Arctic. 1,240 miles in a straight line, right across the top of the world. 2 Norwegians, the only people to have made it across unsupported, did it in 2000. Hugely experienced. They were the Norwegian equivalent, I suppose, of Navy SEALs, Norwegian Marines. They had 105 days of food. It took them 109 days. When they were picked up on the Canadian coastline, there was a doctor in the plane that picked them up, and he described them both as being 48 hours away from death. So this is a journey that is literally at the outer limits of human capability. For some reason, this was also my plan. But I knew if I wanted to get back in one piece, let alone to stand any chance of making it across, I had to take a pretty radical approach. This meant everything from perfecting the sub-2-gram sawn-off toothbrush to working with one of the world's leading nutritionists in developing from scratch a completely new nutritional strategy. We stopped looking at what expeditions had done before. We looked instead at what people like Tour de France cyclists, ultramarathon runners, and ultimately doctors treating cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. We found out they were using a hybrid type of fat called a medium-chain triglyceride, MCTs. So I was the first expedition to use MCTs, 6,000 calories a day, absolutely radical approach to nutrition. And the expedition kicked off in late February of this year. Big team. I had a photographer, a film crew, soundman, cameraman. My girlfriend was with me. I had an expedition manager. We had exactly half a ton of excess baggage as we left Heathrow Airport. The first bit was quite sensible, British Airways to Moscow. From Moscow to Krasnoyarsk was via an internal Russian airline called Crash Air, KRAS. The next bit, flight from Krasnoyarsk up to the town there that's so small it's not even on the map, called Katanga. We chartered a plane, and as we were climbing on board, the sound man, who turned out to be a pretty nervous flyer at the best of times, asked the Russian pilot how long the journey would take, and this guy, the Russian, said completely deadpan, 6 hours if we live. The last little bit up to the island should have been via helicopter, should have been a day waiting in Katanga. We actually had a 10-day delay in Katanga. There was a kind of vodka-fueled pay dispute between the helicopter pilots and the people that owned the helicopters. So we were stuck in Russia, and of course, the window that I had, the time window to do this was shrinking very rapidly indeed, and there wasn't much we could do. Finally, on the morning of day 11, we got the all clear. We had a mad last few hours packing all the kit into these old army trucks, driving to the airstrip, load the helicopters. 5 hours in the helicopter, you can't hear a thing. You've got earplugs, noise of the helicopter falling apart around you. Landed on the ice. We had an hour. The pilots kept the engines running on the pack ice as they dropped me off. We did some filming, did some photography, say goodbye to the team, say goodbye to my girlfriend, and then wham. Door closed. That was the last photograph the photographer took of me, and I was alone. I don't think words will ever quite do that moment justice. Small, scared, frightened, overwhelmed. Ahead of me lay 1,240 miles of what arguably are the toughest conditions to try and ski through on the planet. And what's worse was that, I think you can see here, there's a full moon because of this 10-day delay. A full moon, of course, means the highest and lowest tides. And when you're standing, as I am there, on the surface of the sea, high and low tides aren't particularly good news. So I felt very frightened. I skied for the first hour in floods of tears. My face mask froze up, couldn't see a thing. I felt absolutely out of my depth. I was an idiot. I'd really landed myself in it big time. But what was about to happen on that first day would scare me even more. Including me, there were 4 solo expeditions that started at the same time, different points along the edge of the pack ice. 3 were trying to ski solo to the pole. I was trying to ski all the way across to Canada, twice the distance. Within the first 24 hours, 1 of the 4 was dead. A lady from Finland, hugely experienced skier, hugely experienced mountaineer, missing, presumed dead. And a second of the 4 had been rescued, fallen through thin ice into the water. Very experienced French adventurer. He'd crossed Greenland on his own, massively experienced, massively capable guy. He was in the water for several minutes, had frostbite, all of his fingers, all of his toes, and part of his upper body, so he was rescued. 2 of the expeditions knocked out on day 1. I started with 2 sledges, just so I could fit everything in. I had 95 days of food and fuel, a grand total of 180 kilos, which is almost exactly 400 pounds. Twice as much as I weighed when I started, and pulling it is every bit as tough as it sounds. When the ice was flat-ish, I could pull both. When the ice wasn't flat, I didn't have a hope in hell. I had to pull one, leave it, and go back and get the other one. I was skiing, well, skiing is a kind of optimistic term when the ice is like this. I was skiing 3 miles for every 1 mile north. NASA described the condition of the Arctic pack ice this spring as the worst since records began. The last successful solo and unsupported expedition from Russia, from the Russian side to the North Pole, was 10 years ago. It was in 1994. Back then, the ice had been relatively flat. And of course, the surface ice has become 40% thinner in the last 40 years. 1% a year, this environment is changing. For me, the thinner it gets, the less stable it is. The more of these huge ridges there are as the sheets of ice are forced together, there's less flat, safe ice, more of these pressure ridges, and ultimately more open water. Some huge forces at work. You have the currents of the ocean, the tides, and the wind all moving the ice around. And the direction that the ice drifts depends on which one of these forces is the strongest at any one time. For 9 out of the 10 weeks I was alone, I was drifting backwards. Sometimes it was only a few hundred yards overnight. Other times it was worse. My record was minus 2.5 miles. Got up in the morning, skied for 7 hours, nearly 7 hours flat out, definitely skiing north, put the tent up in the evening, got the GPS out, and I was 2.5 miles further south than when I had started. I literally couldn't keep up with the drift. But the biggest problem of all wasn't the ice itself. It was a distinct lack of ice. Open water, huge areas of open water. In the last 20 years, an area of supposedly permanent sea ice 5 times the size of Great Britain has melted, has vanished. I knew this was happening. I was expecting water, so I had a secret weapon up my sleeve. A dry suit that I'd had specially made that I could climb into, over on my gear. It would go on over the boots, over the mittens. It meant that I could ski across what otherwise would be dangerously thin ice. If I fell through, I wasn't in real trouble. It also meant if the worst came to the worst, I could climb in and actually swim across areas of water that I couldn't ski around. I ended up swimming 9 times in the 10 weeks that I was away. I never quite got used to it. It certainly felt that I was doing something, climbing into the water, that went completely against all of my survival instincts, I suppose. The water was almost certainly what killed Dominic on day 1, and here I was climbing into it. Polar bears hunt around these cracks. They're called leads. Areas of open water are called leads. So polar bears hunt around leads. That's where seals pop up to breathe. In the water itself, there are killer whales, Arctic shark, some of the largest giant squid ever recorded. And this spring, 2 nuclear submarines as well. It's pretty deep. Under the route, I was skiing between 2 and 3 miles deep, and it just looked black, inky black. You cannot see a thing. Warmer than you'd probably expect. Obviously, if it's much below freezing, it's solid. And as long as the dry suit doesn't leak, you stay pretty warm. But every bit as frightening as it sounds. The dry suit worked perfectly. Genuine innovation. As with most genuine innovations, people said I was absolutely nuts to try and do this on my own. Another place I genuinely pushed back the boundaries this spring was communication. This is a photo from Sir Ernest Shackleton's 1912 endurance expedition to Antarctica. Of course, they had absolutely no two-way communication with the outside world. But one of his crew, a chap called Thomas Ord-Lees, had the foresight to suggest that the explorers of 2012, if there is anything left to explore, will carry pocket wireless telephones fitted with wireless telescopes. Well, Ord-Lees guessed wrong by about 8 years. Here's my wireless telephone, iridium satellite telephone in top corner. My wireless telescope was a 5-megapixel digital camera. Despite Compaq saying, quote, the IPAC will not function in those conditions, and Iridium, the people who make or provide the satellite network, saying, quote, PDAs are not currently supported, it won't work, we did get the system working. We had homemade software, homemade cables connecting the iPac to the phone, homemade battery pack charging it all, and I sent back the first ever live video footage from the North Pole on a training expedition last year. Hopefully this will work. You're not missing much. Yeah, it's frozen. That's about 4 seconds. Oh, that's half of it. It's a 200K file. It took me 28 minutes to send back via the phone. I'd like to say it was a genuinely historic moment, but the only thing I remember thinking was what my phone bill was going to look like when I got home. I was starting to panic about that. And this year, on my expedition this spring, for every single one of the 72 days I was alone on the ice, I sent back a daily diary piece. I sent back information on the environment, statistics on my performance, my mileage, temperature, and also a daily photograph. Remember in 2001, we had less than 2 hours of radio communication with the outside world. This year, I was blogging live from an expedition described as 10 times as hard as Everest. And the website, I suppose, or more specifically, the quality of what I could communicate and the level of interactivity we achieved played a major part in my motivation. There were times when the weather closed in. This is called whiteout, where you get very low cloud. There's no distinction between the sky and the snow. That in fact, is a pretty good view for a whiteout day. So Ronald Fiennes described it as like being trapped inside a ping pong ball. You literally, all you see is white. There were times when the weather closed in, and I'd be literally skiing blind. I'd be prodding the ice in front of me if I thought it might be thin ice, prodding it with a ski pole. There were times when I'd fall over, and I'd feel genuinely disappointed to find out that I hadn't injured myself. I hadn't broken my wrist, hadn't twisted my ankle, something that meant I could be picked up with my pride intact. There were times when the ice was literally disintegrating around me. The third expedition, an American guy called Wave Vidmar, was rescued halfway to the pole. After that, I was the only person out there, 1.5 times the size of America. I was the only person there. And the temperatures got pretty warm. Very cold at the start, minus 48 degrees Celsius. Towards the end, minus 5, even hovering around 0 for several days. And there were times when all I wanted was to be back at home with the people that I cared about. Yet, it's difficult to feel lonely when there are close to 8 million people. That was the number of visitors we had in the 3 months to the website. 8 million people following your progress. And it's hard to feel sorry for yourself when you're getting messages of support, feedback through the website from Second World War veterans, from cancer patients, from paraplegics, from hundreds of schools worldwide. And I think the knowledge that what I was doing was in some small way making a positive difference to people's lives was enough to keep me getting up every morning and putting one foot in front of the other for those 31 marathons. It took me 68 days from Russia to reach the pole. 11th of May, I stood at the pole. And there is nothing there. There isn't even a pole at the North Pole. There is nothing there. The reason is because it's sea ice. It's always drifting. Even if I stuck a flag there and left it there, pretty quickly it would drift off. And I knew that. I knew there was nothing there. But I was expecting something. And I have very mixed feelings as I stood there. Partly a huge feeling of elation. I'd finally pulled this off under my own steam with no support in what experts were calling the worst conditions on record. But also I knew that the conditions were getting really crazy, very, very warm, very, very frightening. And I knew the chances of me making it all the way across to Canada, still 400 miles away, were slim at best. Just before the pole, I'd had temperatures of minus one degrees centigrade. It should have been 10 to 15 degrees colder than that. The ice was literally starting to melt around me. And I think, secondly, I couldn't help thinking what a waste it was that someone had lost their life trying to reach the same point, because there is absolutely nothing there. This is the only proof, sort of out of focus photo of my GPS. You can just see a 9 and a row, or an N and a 9 and a string of zeros, 90 degrees north. That's absolutely slap bang on the North Pole. I sat on the sledge. I got the satellite phone out. I actually had 3 answer phones before I got through to someone to tell them what I'd done. My mum was in the queue at the supermarket. She burst out crying. She told me to call her back. I didn't stay at the pole. I wanted to ski for as far as I could towards Canada. So I skied on for a week before the conditions really got out of control. My project team, the group of people back in the UK, were looking at satellite photos they were getting from Environment Canada. They could see areas of water. They could see leads up to 10 miles wide, just south of my position. I was getting pretty good at swimming by this stage, but I didn't fancy chancing my luck at swimming 10 miles. Also, what was happening, I was in an area of very high pressure. You can see nice blue skies, sun shining, nice and warm. Big area of cloud, big area of low pressure rolling into my position. And to be picked up, to be rescued, the pilots from Canada, they're flying fixed-wing planes. They need flat ice to land on, flat, thick ice to land on. The plane weighs 13 tons. And they need clear sky. So the expedition manager said, look, Ben, we're going to make the decision to pick you up while we can safely. We don't know how long this area of bad weather is going to last for. If it's 2 weeks, then chances are by the end of 2 weeks, it's going to be so warm that we cannot land the plane. So Tony said to me, right, Ben, find an airstrip. We need 500 meters of flat, thick, safe ice, nice clear runoff all around it. You've got to mark it out with something, and you've got to ski up and down it, make sure it's nice and flat. Easier said than done. Took me 36 hours. I stayed awake for 36 hours, frantically trying to find a place for the plane to land. I knew that my skis were exactly 1.9 meters long, so I could very accurately measure out this runway. And I finally found a flat bit of ice, skied up and down it several times, and the kind of average calculation was 473 meters. I never told Tony this, never told the pilots this. I thought it would have to do. Made the phone call, the plane took off. I knew it would take 9 hours to reach me from mainland Canada, so I skied up and down, sort of filling in holes and flattening out the bumps of this runway. Finally heard the buzz of the engines over the horizon. I got the camera out, started filming it, and the plane kind of flew in really low, just skimmed over the runway, didn't touch down, had skis on the bottom of the plane, didn't touch down, big wall of ice at the end of it. It certainly wasn't a clear runoff, big wall of ice at the end, just took off, skimmed this wall of ice, disappeared. I heard the engines fade away. I thought, I've been rumbled. They know the airstrip's not long enough. They're trying to find somewhere else. There isn't anywhere else. I've skied all around here trying to find airstrips. The plane can't land. I'm in real trouble. I also knew that the pilot was called Troy. I was expecting someone that does this for a living, called Troy, to be a pretty rough, tough kind of guy. And as I was filming the plane coming around, pretty emotional moment, tears starting to form in the corners of my mouth. I thought, I've got to compose myself for Troy. Finally, the plane came in. It landed on the third approach. Just landed, just managed to miss the sort of rubble ice you can see at the end of my runway. Turned around, taxied out to me. The door opened. This guy jumped out. He was about that tall. And he said, "Hi, my name's Troy." And the pilot was his wife, a lady called Monica, sat there in a kind of hand-knitted jumper. They were the least macho people I've ever met, but they certainly made my day. This is me with an interesting-looking kind of beard and suntan combination. Look of relief that the plane has landed and that my runway was long enough, and slight look of panic that, of course, we had to take off again. Troy said, just get in the back. There wasn't much room elsewhere in the plane. Troy threw his cigarette out as he climbed up the ladder into the front and turned around and said, just hang on tight. I've since learned this is standard practice, but at the time it had me worried. The throttle is on the roof. You can see the control for engines on the roof. So Troy sat on the left, put his hand on the throttle. Monica very gently kind of lay her hand on top of his. I thought, we're in real trouble. This is all or nothing. Rammed it forwards, bounced down the runway. All the fuel drums kind of came back towards me. Wings, clouds of snow, couldn't see a thing. Just took off, just clipped this wall of ice at the end. And Troy, I could see him battling the controls, banking this plane around. Took one hand off, stretched back, just flicked a switch on the roof of the cockpit, and it was the fasten seatbelt sign you can see at the top. And only from the air did I see the big picture. Of course, when you're on the ice, I was going to say on the ground, when you're on the ice, you only ever see one obstacle at a time, whether it's a bit of water, whether it's a pressure ridge. From the air, this was where I was picked up from. This was what it was like. NASA predicts there will be no more permanent sea ice by the end of the century. The Arctic Ocean, by the end of the century, in the summer, will be ocean. There will be no ice. This is climate change at work. And this is one of the most profound, lasting impressions, I suppose, I've taken away from it. Here I am. I've spent a quarter of this year living alone in a tent. Been home for 5 months. I'm going to preempt 3 questions while I still have a couple of minutes left, I think. First one is, what did I achieve exactly? Second one, what's next? Third one, why? What did I achieve? There were 3 records. Youngest person ever to ski solo to the North Pole. I was 26 this spring. I'm the 4th in history to ski solo to the North Pole. And I've skied further alone in the Arctic than any other Briton. What's next? Heading to Antarctica next winter to try and retrace Captain Scott's 1912 journey to the South Pole. He, I don't know if you know the story, Norwegian Amundsen got there first in 1912 with dog sleds. Scott tried to do it on foot with a team of 5 people. Reached the pole 4 weeks after Amundsen, found a Norwegian flag there already, Norwegian tent, turned around, skied back. Scott's team, 5 people died on the way back. No one has ever retraced their steps, so that's what's next. Why? I could really do with a kind of glib one-liner for these occasions. I haven't got one. I think for me, what it boils down to is this. This wasn't about breaking records. This wasn't about exploring in the traditional sense. I wasn't drawing maps. This, for me, was about exploring the limits of technology and ultimately the limits of human potential, exploring human limits rather than geographical ones. It amazes me how many people go through life just scratching the surface of their potential, doing 3, 4, 5% of what they are truly capable of. So I think on a personal level, this was a chance to really, really challenge myself, to see how far my potential stretched. And on a wider scale, I wanted to encourage other people to do the same, not to do anything silly like buy a sledge and a pair of skis, but to think about their own potential and think about what they want to do with the tiny amount of time we all have on this planet. Final thought. I've got a school report at home. It's framed above my desk at age 13. It says, Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile. What I've learned is this. No one else is the authority on your potential. No one decides except for you how far you go. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my story. Thank you very much.